Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, let me put it to you plainly, because sometimes the plain version is the only one that matters. If the United States and Somalia were ever in a hypothetical conflict, which side would you want to win? Speaker Mike Johnson's voice didn't rise when he said it, and that was part of the problem. He sounded like a man reading a deposition caption, calm and careful. The kind of calm that makes people wonder what he thinks he already has in his folder. The House Ethics Committee hearing room didn't erupt, didn't chatter, didn't even shuffle the way busy rooms usually do. It just went still. Like everyone sensed, the question wasn't meant to start a debate, but to trap the air in the room and see who could breathe. Ilhan Omar sat at the witness table with her lawyer to one side and a stack of binders to the other. The familiar posture of someone who's done politics long enough to know that hearings are often theater. For 6 hours, she had done what elected officials do in long hearings: clarify, reframe, correct, redirect, repeat. But this question didn't offer a comfortable pivot, because it wasn't about a line item, a vote, or a memo. It was about allegiance in a way people can feel in their gut. The cameras, C-SPAN cameras, the ones that make everyone look a little more human and a little less heroic, caught her face in the half-second after the words landed. Her eyes flicked toward her attorney like a reflex, and that reflex told the room something even before she said anything. 10 seconds passed, then 20, then the kind of half-minute that feels longer because nobody is scrolling and nobody is whispering. You could see the tiny movements that happen when someone is deciding whether the safest answer is silence or a sentence. Her hands pressed into the edge of the table as if the wood might offer a better response than her mouth could. She started to speak, stopped, then tried again, like a person searching for a door that isn't there. And the longer it went, the more it stopped being about her politics, and became about the fact that she couldn't make herself say what most Americans believe is easy. The room was packed in a way these rooms get packed when people expect a moment. Every seat filled, press packed in, a line of staffers standing along the back wall because there were no chairs left. Mike Johnson doesn't personally run every hearing that crosses his desk, and everyone in that room knew that. So the very fact that he was there, binder closed in front of him like a judge's book, told people this wasn't meant to be a casual scolding. It was meant to be a record. Omar wore a bright turquoise hijab and a dark blazer, dressed like someone ready for the camera, ready for the clip, ready for the part where she delivers a clean statement, and her supporters flood the internet with it. She has survived years of ugly public controversy, and she has learned, like most public figures learn, that the best defense on television is often confidence. But confidence only works when the question lets you keep your balance, and this question didn't. Because the trap wasn't in the words, it was in the fact that any direct answer would be used to argue something larger about identity, loyalty, and trust. And whether you love her or hate her, you could feel the stakes in the pause. Johnson didn't move fast to rescue the moment, and he didn't rush to fill the silence with speeches. He let it sit there, like he wanted the audience to understand that the silence itself was the point. Then he tightened it, not with insults, but with legal language that sounded like it came from a classroom and a courtroom at the same time. "Let me ask it another way," he said, "so nobody can pretend they misunderstood. When you became a U.S. citizen, you took an oath renouncing allegiance to any other country. So did you mean it?" That's where you could see the machinery kick in, the lawyer leaning close, the urgent whisper, the slight shake of Omar's head, as if she were trying to swat away the premise. She finally spoke, but not with an answer, more like a protest. "That's a loaded question," she said, and you could hear the frustration in it. Johnson didn't raise his voice. He just answered like a man who thinks he's already heard every version of that objection. "It's only loaded if you can't answer it honestly," he said, and that line hit harder than any shout ever could. Now, if you're watching this as a viewer, you don't have to decide she's guilty of anything to understand why the moment makes people uneasy. You don't have to buy anybody's grand storyline, and you don't have to assume secret plots behind every disagreement. All you have to do is recognize how the average American hears that question and hears the silence afterward. Most people in that room and most people at home probably think the answer is automatic. You want the United States to win. So when the answer doesn't come, the audience starts asking a different question. Why not? Omar looked cornered, and then she did what politicians do when they're cornered on a question that touches identity. She reached for a larger frame, one that turns the question itself into the offense. "This is a witch hunt," she said, and then she reached for the familiar language of persecution and bias, not because it's always wrong, but because it's often the quickest way to flip the moral energy in the room. She described herself as a target, as a symbol, as someone being punished for who she is rather than for anything she's done. And you can almost see the two audiences splitting in real time. The people who nod because they believe that's the story, and the people who shake their heads because they think it's a dodge. Johnson didn't take the bait in the way a cable news host would. He didn't start trading insults, and he didn't make it personal. He sat there like a lawyer, hands together, eyes steady, and he said, in effect, "I'm not asking about your identity. I'm asking about your responsibilities." Then he opened the binder, and the sound of paper in a silent room can feel like a drum. "Let's talk about facts we can point to," he said, and he made it clear he wasn't going to let the hearing turn into a performance piece. Whether you agree with him or not, that posture changes the whole temperature. He started where these stories usually start: money and communications, the two things that create suspicion faster than anything else in American politics. He spoke about donations and community groups, not as proof of wrongdoing, but as a reason for scrutiny. The way a careful person says, "This raises questions," instead of "This proves crimes." He emphasized that diaspora communities donate to candidates all the time, that advocacy work is real, and that lawful engagement with foreign issues is not automatically disloyal. But then he asked whether lines can blur, whether influence can drift from constituent service into something that looks like coordination. And he kept returning to the same idea. Even if everything has an innocent explanation, the pattern is what people struggle to ignore. Omar's attorney tried to slow the pacing, to challenge framing, to insist the committee not turn ordinary advocacy into insinuation. That's a fair demand in a democracy, because insinuation can be its own kind of weapon. But Johnson's strategy wasn't to win by accusation. It was to win by forcing Omar to speak plainly on the one question he believed the public would understand without a law degree. He let the debate about paperwork, disclosures, and definitions float around the edges, then kept steering back to loyalty like a compass needle. Because he understood that a hearing doesn't have to prove a felony to create political gravity. The strangest part of these scenes, if you've watched enough of them, is how quickly policy disagreement starts sounding like character judgment. Omar's defenders would say her foreign policy positions are ideological, rooted in anti-interventionism and human rights concerns, and that she has every right to criticize U.S. actions abroad. Her critics would say some of her positions look one-sided in ways that make people wonder who she's trying to please. Both can be argued without calling anyone a criminal, and yet the public often hears the argument as a referendum on whether someone belongs. That's what makes this kind of question combustible. because it doesn't just test a policy stance, it tests identity in the eyes of people who already don't trust each other. Johnson, for his part, leaned into the theater of simple. Simple question, he said, not because it's simple in a philosophical sense, but because it's simple as a loyalty test. And in a country that expects its elected officials to pick the flag they serve, simple becomes a weapon. Omar could have tried the straightforward answer, America, and then added her nuance, that wanting America to win does not mean endorsing every decision America makes. But the longer she hesitated, the less any nuance would matter, because the clip would already be written in the audience's mind. Silence doesn't sound nuanced on television. It sounds guilty or afraid, even when it might be neither. So when she said the question was loaded, many people heard, "I don't want to say the line." When she called it a witch hunt, many people heard, "I want to change the subject." And when she framed it as bias, many people heard, "I'm not going to play your game," which is a defensible stance in some contexts and a disastrous one in others. Because on a question like this, refusing the game can look like refusing the country. And that's a perception that doesn't care about footnotes. You can argue whether that perception is fair, but you can't argue that it isn't powerful. If you step back from the personalities, this is what the moment reveals. Americans are hungry for a clean line. They want to believe citizenship means something, and that oaths are not just ceremonial words said once and forgotten. They want to believe that when someone holds office, especially federal office, there's a baseline commitment that sits above ideology and above grievance. And they don't have a lot of patience for rhetoric when the question sounds, to them, like a yes or no. That impatience is what turns a hearing into a spectacle, even when nobody raises their voice. Omar tried to reclaim the moral high ground by describing her biography: refugee, immigrant, citizen, elected representative. That story is real in the sense that those are her facts, and it has power because it mirrors how America likes to imagine itself. But biographies don't answer loyalty questions, not the way audiences hear them. In fact, biographies sometimes make the question sharper, because the public asks, after all that, why not just say it? It's not fair, maybe, but it's human. People think gratitude should sound like allegiance. And when it doesn't, they reach for darker explanations, even if they don't have proof. Johnson used that human instinct like leverage, but he kept his language careful enough to look legal instead of hateful. He didn't have to insult her faith or her ethnicity to create a crisis. He just had to keep repeating the same question until the refusal became the headline. That's the modern hearing strategy. You don't need a conviction, you need a moment. You don't need a verdict, you need a clip. And the clip is not the evidence, it's the silence. Now, if you want to keep this kind of narrative responsible, you have to be honest about what it is and what it isn't. It's not a court case. It's not proof of treason. It's not a substitute for actual law enforcement findings. It's a political drama built around perception. And perception is both weaker and stronger than fact. Weaker because it can be wrong. Stronger because it can destroy you anyway. That's the trap Omar walked into, and it's the trap Johnson laid. A question designed so that any hesitance reads like confession. In a polarized country, the audience doesn't wait for context. It crowns a winner and moves on. So the ending writes itself, not because it proves anything beyond doubt, but because it proves something about politics. Johnson gets his moment. The question hanging, the camera zooming in, the witness refusing to deliver the easy line. Omar gets her counter moment. The accusation that the whole exercise is designed to delegitimize her as an American. Supporters see persecution, critics see exposure, and the middle sees one more reason to distrust everyone. And if you're a narrator watching it all, the only honest conclusion is that the damage is done long before anyone files a report. Because in American politics, once the public thinks they've seen your hesitation, they don't wait around for your explanation. If you want to understand why this kind of scene goes viral, it's not because Americans are obsessed with Somalia or with the technicalities of foreign policy. It's because Americans are obsessed with loyalty, especially when they feel their own loyalty is taken for granted. They're the people paying taxes, raising kids, arguing over grocery prices, and watching the world feel less stable every year. When they see a member of Congress hesitate on a loyalty question, they don't hear nuance, they hear distance. And distance, in politics, is often treated like betrayal, even when it's just complicated human identity. So the final image isn't Omar being proven anything, because proving belongs to courts and facts, not to viral hearing rooms. The final image is Omar trapped between two answers she believes she can't safely give, while Johnson sits steady and lets the silence do the work. The final image is a country watching the same clip and telling two completely different stories about what it means. One story says, she couldn't say it because she doesn't mean it. The other story says, she couldn't say it because the question was designed to humiliate her. And the tragedy, if you want to call it that, is that both stories can spread faster than the truth ever could. And once that clip exists, once the silence is frozen and replayed, the story starts running on its own fuel. People stop asking what actually happened and start arguing about what the moment meant, which is often far more consequential in politics than what can be proven or disproven later. The hearing becomes less about Ilhan Omar the lawmaker and more about Ilhan Omar the symbol, a vessel into which everyone pours their anxieties about immigration, loyalty, identity, and power. That's when nuance dies first. Not because nuance is wrong, but because nuance is slow and outrage travels at broadband speed. Supporters rush in to say the question itself was illegitimate, a trap designed to force a woman with a complex identity into a false binary. They argue, not unreasonably, that people can criticize U.S. policy without hating the country, that caring about one's homeland doesn't cancel one's citizenship, and that hypothetical wars are a cheap way to test patriotism. They point out that many members of Congress hold dual cultural ties, advocate for foreign causes, and speak passionately about ancestral lands without anyone questioning their loyalty. Why, they ask, is Ilhan Omar expected to perform a purity ritual that others are never asked to perform? And in that framing, the silence is not guilt but refusal, a rejection of a premise she sees as unfair. Critics, meanwhile, hear something else entirely. They hear a question that they themselves would answer without hesitation, and they hear the absence of that answer as disqualifying. They don't parse it as philosophy or rhetoric. They parse it as instinct. In their minds, you don't need to love every decision your country makes to know which side you want to survive. So when Omar doesn't say it, they don't hear resistance, they hear avoidance. And neither side is really listening to the other because the argument is no longer about facts, it's about belonging. Belonging is the most combustible subject in American politics because it's rarely defined clearly and almost always weaponized emotionally. Who belongs? Who owes what? Who gets the benefit of doubt? Who must prove themselves again and again? Once a hearing drifts into that territory, no amount of procedural fairness can put it back in a neat box. Mike Johnson understood that dynamic whether he intended to or not. By framing the moment around a single, stark question, he created a test that felt moral rather than legal. Moral tests don't require evidence in the way legal tests do. They require alignment with the audience's intuition. And intuition is shaped less by policy briefs and more by lived feeling. That's why the calm tone mattered so much. It made the question feel inevitable rather than aggressive. If Johnson had shouted, the clip might have looked partisan. If he had lectured, it might have sounded self-righteous. But by asking and then waiting, he let viewers fill the silence with their own assumptions. Silence, in that sense, becomes participatory. Everyone watching becomes a co-author of the meaning. That's also why the moment is so dangerous, even for the person asking the question. Because once politics is reduced to loyalty tests, the tests don't stop where you want them to stop. Today, it's about Somalia and the United States. Tomorrow, it's about Israel, Ukraine, Taiwan, or any number of places lawmakers speak about passionately. Once you normalize the idea that silence equals suspicion, everyone becomes one pause away from scandal. There's a reason most institutions avoid these questions unless they're ready to live with the precedent. History is full of moments where loyalty tests felt righteous at first and corrosive later. That doesn't mean the public's discomfort is fake or irrational. It means it's powerful and blunt. And blunt tools don't distinguish well between genuine concern and collateral damage. Ilhan Omar's problem, in this telling, isn't that she failed to convince a committee. It's that she failed to reassure an audience that wasn't interested in a dissertation on identity. The hearing may end, the investigations may continue or fade, and legal outcomes may or may not materialize. But the clip will remain, stripped of context, replayed in fragments, interpreted through whatever lens the viewer already carries. And no closing statement can outrun that. What gets lost in all of this is the uncomfortable middle ground, the possibility that Omar's silence was not an admission of disloyalty, but a refusal to legitimize a question she believes reduces her humanity. The possibility that Johnson's question, while politically effective, oversimplified something genuinely complex. The possibility that the public can be right to feel uneasy and wrong to leap to conclusions at the same time. Politics rarely rewards that kind of patience. From a distance, the entire scene reads less like a courtroom drama and more like a cultural stress test. How much complexity can the American political audience tolerate before it demands a slogan? How much silence can a politician afford before silence is interpreted as hostility? How quickly does skepticism turn into certainty when it's wrapped in a clean, shareable moment? Those questions don't have partisan answers, they have human ones. In the days that follow, people will argue about whether Johnson crossed a line or whether Omar avoided one. Commentators will dissect body language, word choice, camera angles, and the order of questions. Supporters will insist she was right not to play along. Critics will insist she disqualified herself by hesitating. And most people will quietly add it to their growing pile of reasons not to trust anyone in Washington. That erosion of trust is the real through line. Not espionage, not ideology, not even loyalty in the strict sense. It's the sense that elected officials live in a different moral universe, where the questions regular citizens answer reflexively become strategic puzzles. When that gap widens, hearings stop being about oversight and start being about spectacle. And spectacle, once unleashed, doesn't care who it consumes. If there's a lesson buried in this moment, it's not that Ilhan Omar is uniquely suspect or uniquely wrong. It's that American politics has become addicted to moments that feel clarifying but actually deepen confusion. We want simple answers to complicated identities, and when we don't get them, we assume the worst. Politicians, in turn, learn to either perform the expected answer or reject the question entirely. Neither option builds trust. The irony is that the oath everyone keeps referencing is meant to do exactly that: simplify allegiance in a complex world. But oaths only work when they're paired with a shared understanding of what they require. Does allegiance mean silence about foreign policy disagreements? Does it mean emotional distance from one's past? Does it mean always choosing the same rhetorical posture, even in hypotheticals? America has never fully agreed on those answers. So the scene ends not with resolution, but with a lingering unease that no committee vote can erase. Ilhan Omar leaves the room with her supporters, convinced she stood her ground. Mike Johnson leaves the room with his allies, convinced he exposed something fundamental. The public leaves with more questions than it had before, which is rarely the goal of oversight, but often the result. And somewhere between those exits, the silence keeps echoing, louder each time it's replayed. In the end, the question that matters may not be the one Johnson asked. It may be the one the audience asks itself afterward. What do we actually want from our representatives when identity, history, and policy collide? Do we want clarity at any cost, or honesty even when it's messy? And are we prepared to live with the answers either choice produces? And that question, what we actually want, hangs longer than any silence captured on camera. Because once the moment passes, once the hearing adjourns and the binders close, what remains isn't a finding or a verdict, but a feeling that refuses to settle. It's the feeling that American politics keeps staging tests without agreeing on the rules, then acting surprised when the results inflame rather than clarify. It's the sense that identity and allegiance have been braided so tightly together that pulling on one strand frays the other. And it's the recognition that many of these confrontations are designed less to inform than to force a reaction. From that distance, the hearing reads like a Rorschach test. People see what they already believe. If you think the system is stacked and suspicious of outsiders, you see a trap disguised as oversight. If you think loyalty should be simple and spoken aloud, you see an evasion that confirms your doubts. The facts become secondary to the story people tell themselves about the country and who belongs in it. This is where the personal opinion becomes unavoidable, because pretending to be neutral in a moment like this can be its own form of dishonesty. My own reaction, watching scenes like this play out, is less about taking sides and more about noticing the incentives at work. The incentive for the questioner is to create a moment that travels, a moment that condenses a complicated argument into a few seconds of emotional clarity. The incentive for the witness is to avoid giving that moment oxygen, even if avoidance itself becomes the headline. Both incentives are rational, and both can be corrosive. The strange thing is that the question itself isn't new. Versions of it have been asked, implicitly or explicitly, throughout American history. They've been asked of immigrants, of dissidents, of religious minorities, of activists who challenged prevailing policies. Sometimes the question is framed as patriotism, sometimes as loyalty, sometimes as gratitude. And often, the person being asked understands that no answer will satisfy the people who want the question asked in the first place. That doesn't mean the discomfort around the question is imaginary. It means the country hasn't resolved the tension between plural identity and singular allegiance. America tells itself a story about being a nation of immigrants, but it also tells itself a story about undivided loyalty. Most of the time, those stories coexist without friction. But when politics sharpens them into a yes or no test, the coexistence collapses. What made this moment resonate wasn't the policy substance, because very few viewers were thinking deeply about Somalia or hypothetical wars. They were thinking about tone and instinct. They were thinking about whether the hesitation felt human or evasive. They were thinking about how they themselves would have answered if put on the spot in front of cameras and adversaries. And they were thinking about how often They've been judged not by what they've done, but by what they failed to say quickly enough. That empathy cuts both ways. Some people empathize with Omar, imagining the pressure of being asked a question that flattens her experience into a binary she rejects. Others empathize with Johnson's audience, imagining the frustration of watching leaders speak in abstractions while ordinary people are expected to choose sides in concrete ways every day. Neither empathy is illegitimate. The problem is that empathy doesn't trend well, and nuance doesn't clip cleanly. There's also a deeper irony at play. American politics loves to demand authenticity, but it punishes authenticity when it complicates the narrative. If Omar had answered in a way that acknowledged complexity, saying she wants peace, or rejects the premise of war, or believes allegiance doesn't require cheering for conflict, those words would likely have been edited out. Only the part that sounds like refusal would survive. Authenticity, in that environment, becomes a liability. That's why so many politicians learn to speak in pre-approved phrases, to answer questions they weren't asked, and to pivot so aggressively that the original point disappears. Omar didn't pivot this time, or couldn't, and the cost was immediate. Johnson didn't soften the frame, or wouldn't, and the payoff was just as immediate. Both played their roles, and the audience rewarded the one who produced the clearer image. The aftermath, predictably, didn't produce understanding. It produced camps. It produced hashtags, talking points, and a new set of assumptions layered on top of old ones. People who already mistrusted Omar felt validated. People who already distrusted Johnson felt vindicated. And people who distrust the whole system felt, once again, that politics is less about governing than about humiliating opponents. If there's something unsettling about that, it's because it suggests the process itself has become detached from its stated purpose. Oversight is supposed to clarify. Hearings are supposed to inform. Questions are supposed to illuminate facts that matter for governance. But moments like this feel engineered to produce moral theater rather than institutional improvement. That doesn't mean the underlying concerns should be ignored. Questions about foreign influence, allegiance, and representation are real and legitimate in a globalized world. Members of Congress do interact with foreign governments. They do advocate for policies that affect other countries. They do navigate identities that don't fit neatly into 19th century notions of nationalism. The challenge is how to examine those realities without turning them into loyalty spectacles. The simplest answer, ironically, would be structural rather than personal. Clearer rules about what is expected of lawmakers in terms of foreign engagement. Clearer boundaries about what constitutes advocacy versus coordination. Clearer standards that don't rely on gotcha moments to enforce norms. But structural solutions are slow, and they don't produce viral clips. So the cycle continues. A question is asked. A silence follows. The silence becomes the story. And the public, already cynical, absorbs it as proof that something is rotten, even if they can't articulate exactly what. Cynicism grows not because people are irrational, but because they keep seeing the same pattern with different names. From a personal standpoint, what lingers isn't anger so much as fatigue. Fatigue with the way political discourse collapses complexity into accusation. Fatigue with the way identity is both celebrated and weaponized depending on the moment. Fatigue with the expectation that loyalty must always be performed on demand, especially by people who are already under suspicion. That fatigue doesn't make people disengage quietly. It makes them disengage bitterly. And bitterness is the one thing democracy can't afford in large doses. A system can survive disagreement. It can survive scandal. It can even survive hypocrisy for a time. What it struggles to survive is a public that stops believing the process is even trying to be fair. That's why moments like this matter beyond the personalities involved. They shape how people think the game is played. If the game looks rigged toward spectacle, people will assume outcomes are rigged too. If hearings look like trials without juries, people will assume verdicts are predetermined. And if silence is treated as confession, people will stop speaking honestly at all. In the end, the question Johnson asked may fade, but the question it raised won't. How do we reconcile a nation built on pluralism with a politics that demands singular answers? How do we test allegiance without turning it into a purity ritual? How do we hold officials accountable without reducing accountability to humiliation? Those are not questions for one hearing or one congresswoman. They're questions for a country that keeps telling itself it values complexity while rewarding simplicity. A country that insists it wants truth while consuming performance. A country that asks for unity while thriving on division. Until those contradictions are addressed, scenes like this will keep repeating, with different faces and the same uncomfortable pauses. So the story doesn't really end with the gavel or the clip. It ends with a choice the audience makes, consciously or not. Do we treat moments like this as confirmation of what we already believe, or as invitations to ask harder questions about the system producing them? Do we demand better rules, or do we settle for better soundbites? And are we willing to accept that sometimes the most revealing part of a political moment isn't what anyone says, but what the moment encourages us to assume? That choice belongs to the public more than to any committee or speaker. And it's a choice that will quietly shape the next hearing, the next silence, and the next question that sounds simple, but isn't.